So how's the transition back to school been? You guys hanging in there? Yeah. You guys were back here yesterday, right? Yeah. Classes go okay and everything?
Yeah.
Decent? Yep, here we go. What's up? How you doing? Come on in. Have a seat anywhere you like. Take group?
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So, wait, somebody said something? What'd you say? Oh, yes, exactly, right? That has to have been weird for you guys, going through this during high school and like, oh, just like a year away from school. Did you guys spend most of your time just inside at your house? Yeah. Kind of a drag, really. All the classes, too, have been so quiet. Nobody says anything. It's just like a Zoom meeting, except for you're actually here. So, all right. Very good. Well, it's really, for me, this is the fun part of the job, is, getting to know you guys and having an actual interaction with you. So I'm happy to have you all here, and, and then we go on spring break. Just to let you know, in case you haven't heard this yet. So evidently the CDC has decided that now appropriate social distancing is okay to be 3 feet instead of 6 feet. I don't know if you've heard this yet. I don't know what commission decides these things, but as a result of this, they are likely going to be changing the schedule again, so that when you guys come back from spring break, they are most likely going to combine A and C cohorts together and B and D cohorts together. So I don't have any further news than that, but I'm just putting it on your radar that be prepared for change, because it's likely to happen. The union, the teachers' union, is meeting with the district tomorrow to renegotiate the schedule and stuff like that. So we'll see how that all comes to fruition. But just making sure you knew about it. All right. So this morning's lecture with the C cohort kids, I finished up talking about D-Day, June 6, 1944. It's basically the beginning of the end for the Nazis and Hitler. I guess the beginning of the end, you could say, goes all the way back to Stalingrad. Have you guys been watching those documentaries that I assigned? What do you think about them? Pretty interesting, hey? I think it's cool because it's all actual footage that you're seeing. Those people were actually fighting, and it's not reenacted, and it's pretty easy to watch, and I think the narration is pretty good on it as well. There is an American version, an American narrated version I refuse to use because I feel like British narration sounds so much more educationally fancy, Do you guys ever watch those like nature documentaries with what's his name? Richard, is it David Attenborough or Richard? It's David Attenborough. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. These polar bears are wandering through the polar, like that guy. It's great. How can you not love British narration? I don't know. It just makes every documentary better, in my opinion. But, all right. So, the Nazis have been fighting against the Soviets on the eastern side of Europe. After Operation Torch, where Rommel in North Africa was defeated, they start coming up through the south of Europe, through Italy, and now they're coming in from the west, from France, and they're liberating France, which has been, remember, under Nazi occupation, going all the way back to the very start of the war, 1940. So by the time, France has been occupied for 4 full years by the time that D-Day happens. And despite the fact that there were, of course, tremendous losses from the Allied powers on D-Day, ultimately, they do succeed in taking the beachhead and start systematically making their way into northern France. I think I mentioned in one of the lectures earlier this week, just because you made it through D-Day, it wasn't a guarantee that you were going to make it through to the end of the war. there were still more battles to be fought, and the Nazis were not just going to turn around and go home with their tail between their legs because of the Normandy D-Day operation. They continue fighting, and so I mentioned my grandma had a cousin in World War II who died about 3 weeks after D-Day because he was shot by a German sniper. And those kinds of things happened, you know, and so they continued to really struggle to take every single little town and city. If you ever travel through northern France, it's kind of, you know, it's different traveling through Europe than through America. In America, you come across small towns, but they all more or less kind of look the same. You got a gas station, you got a little supermarket or whatever. European towns are weird because they're super old, and so you'll travel through these cities, but they have these winding roads, and it's much more rustic and countryside looking. And all of them in northern France are basically occupied by the Nazis, and the Allied powers have to go to these tiny little towns, town by town by town, and liberate them, take them away from Nazi control. So here you can see a photograph on this slide. I'll try and move this over here so the kids on the internet can see it. This is the slide I'm on right now. And you can see the magnitude of this operation here. Look at the size of those ships that are pulling up to shore, and those ships would have all sorts of military equipment, tanks, trucks, armored vehicles, you name it. Lots and lots and lots of supplies that they are now bringing to the shore after the shore has been taken and the Nazis have been pushed back. By this point in the war, it must be mentioned, Hitler is becoming unraveled, okay? Adolf Hitler, and you'll see this, I think, in episode 5 of the documentary, maybe episode 6, he is coming down with Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is the same illness that, if you've ever heard of an actor named Michael J. Fox, he was in the old Back to the Future movies, and it makes you shake uncontrollably. Hitler had a number of doctors who were basically pumping him full of drugs, including like methamphetamines and stuff like that. He had like cocaine eye drops that he was using. The guy was completely cracked out on drugs. And by the end of the war, he doesn't trust anyone. He's becoming increasingly hostile and paranoid. He fires all of his top military commanders and puts people who he thinks are loyal to him in charge. Hitler is a mess by the end of the war. And so and it's one of the reasons that Normandy is the D-Day operation is successful. But there is a bulge in the front line as the American troops are trying to liberate France and push their way over into Germany, making their way kind of southeast. There ends up being a large kind of gap or bulge in the front line. And so this next slide where it says the Battle of the Bulge is what it becomes known as, is because this bulge in the front line, the Nazis did one last-ditch effort to try to use the blitzkrieg tactics to drive through that bulge in the front line and surround the enemy, but it fails. So Hitler's last gasp offensive happens in December, 6 months after the Normandy invasion. Hitler's last gasp offensive to drive Allies away from the Western German border, but ultimately it fails. And when it fails, the Allied forces, the British and the Americans, quickly penetrate deep into Germany afterwards. They rapidly do a counterattack and just drive right into Germany. And so the Battle of the Bulge is a wintertime assault. Here you can see you can tell, if you know your history, you can tell the soldiers by the helmets that they're wearing. And so this is an American soldier because that's the style of helmets that the Americans wore. But as you can see, in France in the wintertime, it's still cold, it's snowy, and that's a tank coming through. I'm pretty sure that's a Panzer tank. But that's kind of the conditions that they're fighting in during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. And here you can see another image of, looks like on this one, those have got to be American soldiers, I believe. I'm trying to, let's see closer on this one. Sometimes you can tell by the weapons they're holding. I'm pretty sure those are American soldiers there because of the shape of the helmets. But it looks like they're holding MP40s. I don't know. Tough to tell on this picture. But anyhow, this is the Battle of the Bulge. Oh, hey, what's up, man? What's say it again? Oh, okay. No problem. Just have a seat. You're good. Yeah. So there's another battle that takes place right around the same time. It's a battle that a lot of people don't talk about in World War II, but it's pretty amazing. If you're interested in this sort of thing, I won't waste your time talking about it right now because we got to talk about some other things. But if you're interested in this sort of thing, look up the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, H-U-R-T, like Hurt, G-E-N, Hurtgen Forest, and amazing story from the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, which was bleak. It was a bad battle for America in World War II, where the Germans really gave the Americans a shellacking. But ultimately, America was able to bounce back from it and emerge victorious. So that's another one that doesn't often get talked about, but is one of the untold stories of World War II. This morning, if you caught this morning's lecture, we were talking about some diplomacy in the war. Diplomacy, that's meetings that happen, political, diplomatic meetings between global leaders. And in the very tail end of the war, there's a conference held at Yalta. And Yalta is, I believe, in Crimea. If you don't know where Crimea is, picture Ukraine, which maybe you don't know where Ukraine is. There's a little peninsula called the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea, and Yalta, I believe, is located there. And the big three, Stalin, Churchill, FDR, met again here. Remember, they had previously met before at the Tehran Conference in 1943. Now we're in 1945. This is just months after FDR was elected to his fourth term in 1944, and just months before Roosevelt dies. Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. So at the Yalta Conference, they meet again. Stalin once again reaffirmed his promise to FDR to enter into the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. However, now he added an extra caveat to that, saying we need 3 months to refit our troops, resupply, and mobilize our troops over on the other side of Russia, which is huge. So he basically says, I'll enter the war against Japan, but I need 3 months to, recoup. And then Stalin also agreed at this meeting, and this is important, this little part here, Stalin agreed to, quote-unquote, a declaration of a liberated Europe, which called for free elections, democracy. Now, in case you're not following, remember that Stalin is the communist leader of Russia. There is no democracy in Russia. It's a totalitarian dictatorship. So it sounds weird that Stalin would agree to free elections in a liberated Europe. He agrees to it at Yalta, but then shortly thereafter, he takes back that promise. So he basically says, no, I'm not going to do that later. And instead, I'm going to keep the Russian military in Eastern Europe, and I'm going to occupy each of the nations of Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference, they also decided that the first meeting of this international organization that they've been talking about for years is going to meet in the United States starting in April of 1945. So the first United Nations meeting would happen in April of 1945. Also, at this meeting, at the Yalta Conference, they decided that Germany, once they had been defeated and the war in Europe was over, Germany would be divided into 4 zones. They would take Germany and carve it into 4 sections. And the idea was that each of those sections would be assigned to a different victor of the war. So one section would be the American sector, one section would be the British sector, one section would be the Soviet sector, and then another sector they were actually going to give in control to France, even though France really didn't participate in the war that much. So Germany was going to be divided into 4 occupied zones, and a coalition government of communists and non-communists was agreed to for Poland, because remember that when the war ends, Germany was going to get kicked out of Poland. They're going to reestablish Poland as a state, and they agreed at Yalta, hey, we're going to make Poland both part communist and part non-communist. And then the Soviet Union was promised at the end of the war that they would keep their pre-1939 territory, that the Soviet Union would not lose any territory that they had before 1939. Also, Franklin Delano Roosevelt accepted Soviet control over areas in northern China, in outer Mongolia, and some other areas as well. So they're having this big conference at Yalta. They're talking about several different issues, the UN, what's going to happen with Germany, who gets to have what land after the war, and all that sort of stuff. Excuse me. And then we finally get to what is sometimes called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And this happens on May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day, where Germany formally surrendered. Now, already about a week before that, Hitler had committed suicide in a bunker, underground bunker, in Berlin, the capital of Germany. So, and the story there is pretty crazy too. You may have heard this in the documentary. All of Hitler's top guys, Joseph Goebbels and various other top Nazi commanders, were in this bunker with him, and their families as well. Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress, was in there. His dog, Blondie, was in there with him. There's a famous scene, you've probably seen it because it was turned into a meme, like a video meme sort of a thing, a few years ago. Has anyone seen the meme on YouTube or wherever where it's like Hitler finds out something or other? And it's an actor playing Hitler, and he's speaking in German, and then they put in fake subtitles, okay? One of the funniest ones, I seriously laughed out loud at it several times, lolled at it, if you will, was the one where Hitler finds out he failed the AP European History exam, and it's absolutely hilarious. But anyway, there is a famous movie, I think it's called Downfall. It's actually in the German language, and it's about Hitler's last days in that underground bunker. He kills his dog. He and Eva Braun both commit suicide. They had a secret wedding, or marriage ceremony rather, underground in this bunker. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda Goebbels, they kill all of their children by cyanide tablets, and then they commit suicide as well. And you might ask, like, why? Why did they all just commit suicide right before the end of the war? The answer is the Soviet Union was invading Berlin, and if the Soviets had found them, they would have gone through untold torture. Not to mention their lives were over anyway, because if they had been captured alive, which the Soviets would not have allowed, because the Soviets got to Berlin first, if they had been captured alive, they no doubt would have been executed anyway because of all the war crimes that they committed. So, you know, they knew it was over, and that ends that. That was the end of Hitler. That's the end of the Nazis. That's the end of the Third Reich. And it's the end of World War II in Europe. But there's still another problem, and that is Japan. The war with Japan was still going on. Remember that Stalin in Russia had promised after 3 months to join in and help the Americans out with the battle against Japan. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies, his vice president, a guy by the name of Harry Truman, took over. Harry Truman becomes president in April of 1945, and about 2 months or so after the end of the war in Europe, they hold another meeting at Potsdam. Potsdam is just outside of Berlin, but Berlin's already been conquered by this point. The other thing about the capture of Berlin is that if you go to Berlin today, Berlin is one of the most modern-looking cities in Europe. And the reason Berlin looks so modern is because as the Soviets were invading with their ground forces, as the army of the Soviet Union was on land walking into Berlin, the Americans and British, switching off between day and night, were doing 24-hour carpet bombing of Berlin. Virtually every single building in Berlin was absolutely bombed to smithereens. And so these days, when you go to Berlin and you're traveling around Berlin, most of Berlin looks really new because after the war, they had to clear out all the rubble and rebuild the whole place up again. So it's actually one of the most new places in Europe, if you will. So in July, a couple months after Hitler killed himself, Stalin, Harry Truman, and a new prime minister, Winston Churchill, got voted out as prime minister, and he is replaced by a new prime minister in Britain by the name of Clement Attlee. And so they become kind of the new leaders of their nation. Stalin's still the same, but they come in and they meet at Potsdam outside of Berlin, and it was at this conference that Stalin finds out that America has atomic bombs. And interestingly enough, he may have even known before this because there were Russian spies involved in what was known as the Manhattan Project, which the Manhattan Project was the code name for the project to develop the atomic bombs. When we developed the atomic bombs, we made 3 of them. One of them was to be used for testing. So when we tested the bomb, we only had 2 left. Now, these atomic bombs were the biggest bombs that any nation had ever developed. It's literally a nuclear weapon. And the way that it works, in case you're curious, like what makes an atomic bomb different than just like a regular bomb, it's that what they put into it is a really unstable, you guys are STEM kids, so you probably know more about that. You guys in chemistry this year? Yeah. They put in to the active ingredient, if you will, in atomic bombs is a very unstable isotope of uranium. And they eventually move on to making other ones out of plutonium and stuff like that, hydrogen and stuff like that. But the ones that they had at this time were uranium bombs. And this unstable isotope has a bunch of electrons that are floating around it kind of haphazardly. And because it's unstable, if one of those electrons flies off and smashes into another one of those atoms, that atom explodes, all of the electrons fly off of that into all of the other atoms, and it creates a chain reaction called nuclear fission. And it creates untold amounts of energy. Okay, huge amounts of energy. And so they say when an atomic bomb explodes that it's, like as bright as the sun, and it's so hot. Whenever an atomic bomb goes off, there's 2 shock waves. The first one goes at the speed of light, and it basically burns everything to a crisp. The following one is the actual physical explosion of all the energy being released, which follows the light, which travels faster. So when that energy shock wave hits you, it just blows everything away. And they blow the bomb up. They don't drop the bomb on the ground. When they blow up an atomic bomb, they explode it about a mile in the air. because if you were to drop it on the ground is going to absorb a lot of that explosion. If you explode it in the air, the explosion comes down and reaches a lot farther out. Does this make sense to you guys? Don't tell anyone I told you about how a nuclear bomb works. I'm totally kidding with you. It's perfectly legitimate to talk about. But anyway, the bomb they chose 2 targets at this time, and at the Potsdam Conference, the reason we're talking about this is because Truman, without saying that he has atomic bombs, issues a warning to Japan: surrender now unconditionally or face utter devastation. They, of course, have no idea what's to come. They had no idea that America had these massive bombs, but we only had 2 of them. So we dropped the first one. I'll talk about it in a second here, but oh, and by the way, it was at this conference. Remember I told you how before Stalin had promised free elections in a liberated Eastern Europe? At this conference already, just a couple of months later, he's already flip-flopped. He changed his mind. He said, nope, we're not having free elections in Eastern Europe. Truman, by the way, hates Stalin, so they didn't get along. Also, just to finish up Yalta really quick, at the Yalta conference, at the Potsdam conference, approvals were given to the concept of war crime trials. So now that the war is over, they're talking about how are we going to go about, for the remaining high command Nazis that didn't kill themselves, and the SS and all these other people who were committing the Holocaust, how are we going to go about putting these people on trial and then ultimately executing them? And then how are we going to denazify Germany? Because so many people in Germany supported the Nazis. Reparations from Germany, in other words, Germany paying for the war debts, similar to the way they did in World War I, the way that they would do it is by taking materials from each of the respective zones that they were going to occupy of Germany by carving it up. And during this conference, it was when Truman ordered the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. So let's switch our focus over to Japan and finish up the story there real quickly. An edict, or an order, is issued that ordered civilians, the Emperor of Japan, ordered civilians on the main Japanese islands to construct bamboo spears and meet any invaders on the beaches. So now Hirohito is taking the entire population of Japan that so far has not been involved militarily in the war, just regular citizens, men, women, children, elderly folks, and saying, you will grab any weapon you can find and you will meet these people at the beaches and you will attack. So by all indications, Japan is not going to surrender. Remember, surrender is not something it's the most dishonorable thing a person could do in Japan. U.S. bombers, meanwhile, bombing planes, B-29s and stuff like that, produce an absolute firestorm in Tokyo. They killed 100,000 people in 2 days by dropping just regular napalm bombs on them. And then the United States, Britain, and China each issued the Potsdam Declaration demanding Japan's surrender. May 1945, Japan still refuses to surrender. The United States is using their Navy to completely blockade all of their ports to prevent any food, supplies, oil, anything from entering into Japan, to try to starve them out, make it so that they could not bring in any new materials to continue their war effort. However, everybody in the American military is really concerned about what doing a land invasion would mean in Japan. Japan is not super easy to invade. Number one, it's an island. Number two, it's super mountainous, so the topography of it would make it really difficult to do a land invasion because you'd be climbing mountains and people could hide a million different places. It would mean countless more American lives lost in the name of doing a land invasion. Truman wants to bring the war to an end as quick as possible. So he chooses to end the war swiftly using those atomic bombs. The B-29 bomber that carried the bombs was called the Enola Gay. That was the name of the plane. And the Enola Gay is a big bomber plane. It has a crew of several men on it. And These men flew at very, very high altitudes. When they drop the bomb has a parachute on it to slow it down so that the plane can fly away without experiencing effects from the blast. And we struck two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why those two? Tokyo, it was no threat from Tokyo anymore. It had already been completely burned to the ground. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cities that had gone relatively untouched throughout the war, and the bombs would have a bigger impact there. Now, of course, when we drop these bombs, it instantly kills these people, most of them. There are other people on the outskirts of the where the bomb struck that ended up facing devastating health effects from radiation, developed cancer, had terrible burns, really, really gnarly health effects from the atomic bombs being dropped. Here is the crew of the Enola Gay standing in front of the actual plane that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The way the bombs looked, they were quite large, okay? They're probably about, 4 or 5 feet long. They had different designs. One of them was called Little Boy, and it was dropped on Hiroshima, which killed 140,000 people nearly instantaneously on August 6th. That one was the one on the left up here. The one on the right was a plutonium bomb. That one was called Fat Man, and it was dropped 3 days later. Basically, the idea was we'll only drop one. We won't do both of them on the same day. We'll just drop one on the first day, and we'll hope that within the next couple of days, Japan surrenders. Well, they don't. And then the second one is dropped. That kills another 74,000 people instantaneously. And then Japan starts thinking to themselves, how many of these things do they have? You know, are they going to drop 2 more? Are they going to drop 5 more? Are they going to drop 10 more? They didn't know. So they then surrender. And here you can see the actual photographic images of the mushroom clouds that are created when these bombs are dropped. Now, in the grand scheme of things, although this is the only time that nuclear bombs have been used in any wartime situation, the only time nuclear weapons have been used in war is in the end of World War II by the Americans against the Japanese. It's the only time in history that it's happened. And by the way, let's hope that it stays that way, okay? Because these bombs that you're seeing here, despite how big and devastating they were, are nothing compared to the bombs that they create in the following 10 years after World War II ends. These days, I don't even want to imagine the kind of untold destruction that could come from the countless nuclear warheads that the United States military has in its arsenal, many of which are on nuclear submarines today. You know, it's crazy to think about, but these bombs are nothing compared to the bombs that are made just 10 years after the war ends in the 1950s in my parents' childhood are 10 times more deadly than these ones, okay? After World War II, when we come back from break, which, by the way, I was going to mention that to you guys, unfortunately, there's no real other way for me to do this than to test you when you get back from spring break. Not ideal, I know, but that's why over break I'm going to give you some review stuff to make sure you can stay fresh on this stuff that we've been learning about for the last couple of weeks, so that you can come in and feel prepared to take the test when we get back. We'll see how that pans out. I may do a review day or something like that before. I'll try not to just throw the test on you the first day you guys come back to school. But anyhow, point being though that after this unit, we're going to move into the Cold War. And the Cold War is different than World War II. It's not an actual war. It's more of like a competition, I guess I would say. But the Soviet Union and the Americans during the Cold War, each of them together has enough nuclear warheads to completely destroy the planet 100 times over. That's how many nuclear weapons they have, okay? We're talking about very, very tense times during the 1960s. So here you can see some of the aftermath of what these bombs do, and look at the amount of just rubble laying on the ground there. Here's another image of a photograph that was taken shortly thereafter. Now these days, and really frankly shortly even after the war, even though this atomic bomb went off and there was radiation, there's really no long-term effects of radiation in either of these cities. Today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still both cities in Japan. You can go there. It's not dangerous or anything like that. The reason being is because, like I told you, the bomb was exploded above the ground. And so a lot of that radiation stays up in the atmosphere and doesn't come down to Earth's surface. That's different than like Chernobyl, where it was you guys have probably heard of Chernobyl before. It was a nuclear power plant in Ukraine that in 1986 basically blew up. And today you cannot go to Chernobyl because all of that radiation is still on the ground there, and you'd get sick, and there's like crazy animals that like run through Chernobyl that are like all deformed and stuff from radiation affecting their DNA and so on. Anyway, here you can see pathways carved into where all this rubble lay after the bombs went off. You can see all the trees have the branches and leaves ripped off of them. It's quite devastating. From the top down, I want to show you this. This is Nagasaki before the bomb went off. Okay, this is before the bomb. You can see here almost like there's like a track, almost like a football field, track and field sort of a thing there in the middle. Bunch of buildings and homes and stuff like that. That's before. This is after. Okay? So before the bomb, after the bomb. You can see just how unbelievably devastating the bomb was. It levels everything within 2,000 meters. Some of the aftermath, and I know that these images are hard to look at, but you can see the burns that these poor souls had. People burnt to a crisp. The clothing pattern of this woman's dress that she was wearing was burnt into her skin. She was at a distance far away enough where she wasn't killed by the blast, but no less suffered radiation burns. Some people, it's ghostly, but it's true. The initial blast of the bomb travels at the speed of light, and it's super, super, super hot. And so this ladder and this guy were standing there when the bomb went off, and their shadows were burnt into the side of the building. That's how hot this is. Down there, a person was standing in front of those steps, and their shadow was literally burned into the concrete around where they were standing. That's how nuclear bombs work. All right? Here you can see the high military command of the Japanese military aboard USS Missouri, American ship in Tokyo Bay, and this was where the Japanese government and military officially, unconditionally surrendered to the Americans. In terms of the last couple slides here, effects of World War II, take a look at these numbers, all right? These are the numbers of people killed either from the military or as civilians. The United States lost about 300,000 people in World War II, about 300,000. Now remember, we weren't in it for the entire time. We only joined the war at the very, very, very end of 1941. So from 1942, 3, 4, and half of 45, we lost 300,000 men. That's quite a few. Great Britain lost about the same number. Germany, 2.8 million Germans killed in the war. Another 2.3 civilians from Germany killed in the war. France lost about 210,000, another 173,000 civilians. And here's where it's really startling. The Soviet Union, 14.5 million, and that's a conservative estimate. It could be as much as 20. 14.5 million civilians and military, and another 7 million civilians. They estimate that the Soviet Union lost anywhere between about 22 to 30 million people. They don't even know exactly the number of people that were killed from the Soviet Union in World War II. Tremendous losses. No one felt World War II worse than the Soviet Union. It was so bad. There were so many men killed in World War II from the Soviet Union that if you look, I don't know if you know what a population pyramid is. It measures populations of men and women over the decades. So many men were killed in World War II that for the next generational after effects, you can see divots in their population pyramid because there just weren't enough men to partner with women to produce children. So generationally, the generation of men lost in World War II, the after effect of that you can see again because it just rippled through the ages how many men were lost in this conflict. China also lost. Most people don't know this, but the country that lost the second most people was China. And it had in part to do with Japan, but it also had in part to do with in China there were a lot of civilian deaths as a result of starvation, disease, and things like that. Japan lost about 1.5 million people, plus another 600,000 civilians as well. So, really very devastating war in terms of the loss of life and total, including all of those that were missing. Whereas in World War I, the total death toll was about 10 million people. This is 5.5 times as much, about 55 million people killed in World War II. That is roughly about, I'm going to guess, 7 times the population of all of Los Angeles and surrounding areas. Okay? Huge numbers. Millions after the war, particularly in Germany and Soviet Union, were left homeless. Just no cities to go home to. There was nothing left. Also in Japan, much of Europe was in ruins. It took decades to rebuild the economy of Europe. So, mass devastation of Japanese infrastructure. Japan ends up being largely rebuilt by the British, which is why to this day in Japan they drive on the left-hand side of the road rather than the right, just like Britain does. And then indigenous people of North and Western Pacific Islands were devastated by disease, cultural contamination from the Americans and others coming in there, collateral damage, and various atrocities. Women played an even larger role in the World War II than in World War I, and they again gained more rights after the war in various locations. And in the United States and the Soviet Union, after World War II ends, they emerge as the two global dominant powers on Earth's surface, and they immediately turn around after the war, which they were allied in, and now start a global competition against one another of capitalism versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism. And that ultimately results in 40 years of the Cold War, which is the next unit that we have. Folks, that brings me to the end of the World War II unit. Any questions? All right, well, the bell is right about to ring here for all of you that are tuning in at home. Thank you for tuning in, and I will be putting up an assignment on Canvas today for the final episode of Apocalypse World War II, and also putting up some review assignments for you guys to do to prepare for the exam the week following spring break. Okie dokie.